kindly thumbs up if everything's okay so that we can begin today's lesson. Okay. Got it. So today would be our last concept lecture for 99.2. And like what you mentioned, so we're done now with PPE, right? So in terms of property, plant, and equipment, we already know how to initially recognize it and also the subsequent measurements, particularly the various depreciating methods. So to just finish all of our long-term assets, we're gonna be taking a deep dive into the two other common long-term assets, particularly intangible assets and also mineral resources. So in terms of the overall parang structure of the discussion, it's still gonna be the same thing. Wherein we're gonna take a step back. Let's again review our long-term assets. And then from there, we're gonna take a deep dive into intangible assets and then mineral resources, particularly how do you initially recognize them and how do you subsequently measure. And then at the end, just for appreciation, and also just so that you have a clear idea of how it works in real life, we're gonna end with analyzing the financial statement by showing you some examples of financial statements. So going back in terms of our overview for long-term assets, basically, I think we've seen this slide before, that your long-term assets naman talaga can be broken down into major classes. And some of the major classes would be property, plant, and equipment, which is something that we've already mastered. And then we also differentiated PPE from investment property. So the difference is the investment property, it's held for either rentals or capital appreciation. Hindi siya for operations, right? And then the only two things that we have to master to just round out everything for 99.2 would be two things: our intangible assets and our mineral resources. So intangible assets actually very similar to PPE na marami siyang types, right? So you'll have your patent, copyright, all the way to your franchise and goodwill, right? So in essence, honestly, like what I was telling people also when they were consulting, in terms of intangible assets and mineral resources, they're practically the same as PPE with different names. They're just categorized differently, but the way you account for it is the same. They just have different terms. So if you have depreciation for property, plant, and equipment, for intangible assets, you don't depreciate it, but you amortize it, right? And then for mineral resources, you sort of depreciate it, but the term is called depletion. So in essence, pare-pareho lang yan. If parang gets na gets nyo na yung PPE, this is just gonna be another parang two sets of PPE under different names because they have different classification. So the important thing here lang is we understand what are the similarities and what are the differences between your PPE, your intangible assets, and your mineral resources. So with that said, let's take a closer look at what are intangible assets, right? And in essence, as the name suggests, intangible assets are identifiable non-monetary assets without physical substance. So in essence, bakit siya naging intangible assets? Because of these three major characteristics, or you can remember it as WIN, right? So W, one of the core characteristics of intangible assets, kaya nga intangible, is because it's without physical substance. So this is something that you can't touch, right? When you say copyright, when you say patent, of course there are contracts or there are documents that symbolize that you have a copyright or a patent. But generally, the idea of like a copyright or a patent is more of a right, like, right? So since it's a right, this is, you can't touch human rights. Like, it's a concept, right? It's a protection. So the first characteristic of intangible assets is it's not physical, or it's intangible or without physical substance. The second thing is that it's not enough that it's without physical substance. The second, and I think the most important, is it should be identifiable. So for an intangible asset to be considered an asset, it should be identifiable. And how do you say that something is identifiable? There are two sub-characteristics for it to be identifiable. Number one, it should arise from contractual or legal rights. Meaning, how am I sure that company X or company Y have patents? they can show me a contractual obligation or a government grant saying na I have a patent for this, I have a franchise for this, etc., etc. So number one, for it to be identifiable, it should have a source. Okay? Second, it should also be separable from the entity. So I'll take a deep dive into what separable means later. But just take note that it has to be identifiable, meaning it should arise from a contractual or legal right. And that too, it could be separated or split from the entity, meaning the asset or the company itself. And then lastly, it should be non-monetary. So if people ask you, what are intangible assets? You just think W without physical substance. I, it should be identifiable, meaning it should come from a contractual or legal right and separable. And then finally, N, it needs to be non-monetary. Kaya, the strict definition is it's an identifiable non-monetary asset without physical substance. So what do we mean by separable? So again, it's capable of being separated and divided from the entity. Meaning, you have company A, and then they have contractual rights or legal rights. These contractual or legal rights in the form of like patents, copyright, you can separate them from the entity, right? So you can then individually or together be sold, transferred, licensed, rented, or exchanged. Right? So the idea or the key characteristic of an intangible asset is it must be separable. So now that we're clear on what are intangible assets, the next question is, so how do you account for intangible assets? Honestly, it's the same as property, plant, and equipment. And honestly, in terms of all of our other topics, mapapansin nyo naman, in all of the specific topics in accounting, even in liabilities, you'll always just ask yourself three things. How do you initially recognize? How do you subsequently measure? And then how do you dispose of your asset, liability, or equity, right? So for initial recognition, same with PPE, it's really all about classification. But now here, hindi naman sila kasing as confusing na ito ba land, ito land improvement, itong building. Mas clearer yung boundaries of what patents are, what our copyrights are. But more importantly, you need to know how to initially recognize them for them, right? Second, in terms of subsequent measurement, rather than depreciation, it's still the same concept generally. But the term now for intangible assets would be amortization. And then for disposal, which I think we'll just quickly touch upon, pero mostly theory, is sale or exchange. So, unlike PPE na I'm telling you now, parang may focus on disposal, like sales and exchange. For mineral assets and intangible assets, honestly, it's mga short props lang. Focusing more on initial recognition, tama ba how you value your intangible assets and mineral resources? And tama ba how you compute for amortization and depletion? Amortization for IA. So, ang ifo-focus natin for today's lecture really is initial recognition and subsequent measurement. Similarly to PPE, literally, it's the same. You measure intangible assets at cost, pero subsequently, or after a period, ganyan, you should measure it at net intangible assets, which is basically the cost of the intangible assets minus accumulated amortization minus accumulated impairment. So this looks similar. It's literally like the same PPE slide. Pinalitan mo lang yung amortization, right? So let's first go to initial recognition. So when do you recognize intangible assets? Well, number one, you recognize when you have SIF, right? So when your entity controls your intangible assets, it's identifiable or clear yung origin niya. So if it's a government grant, usually is the one that gives you a patent or a copyright. When you acquire a business, that's usually when a goodwill arises. And then when you have contracts, those are gonna be the sources of your franchise. And then third, this intangible assets will give you future economic benefits. So again, you initially recognize intangible assets at cost when you have fulfilled the three criteria: that the entity has control, that it's identifiable, and that it provides future economic benefits. Now, how do you subsequently measure? Right? So from here, we know that we measure at net intangible assets. So similarly, pareho lang siya ng PPE, but iba lang yung name, right? If the PPE depreciates, an intangible asset amortizes, right? So, pero may mga nuances lang. Like, sa depreciation, you have 3 methods. But in amortization, it's more straightforward, but it also has one nuance. And that nuance would be, your intangible assets actually can have a finite or indefinite useful life. So, you have to be aware if it's a finite or indefinite useful life. So how you amortize or how you subsequently treat an intangible asset will greatly depend on the type of useful life that asset has. So like what I mentioned, so ang net intangible asset is cost minus accumulated amortization minus accumulated impairment. Now, the question is, do you amortize all intangible assets? No. Again, do you amortize all intangible assets? The answer is no. It depends on their useful life. If it's a finite or it has a clear number of useful life, then that's the only time you amortize periodically. So depende on your accounting periods. So usually the accounting period's yearly. The reason why I didn't put annually is because baka iba lang yung periods, right? But in essence, annually is periodically, right? And then, if it's as an indefinite useful life, you don't amortize. Okay? So if a intangible asset has an indefinite useful life, you don't amortize. Instead, you test for impairment annually. Get? So to summarize, first question when you see an intangible asset, does this intangible asset have a finite or indefinite useful life? If finite, I will amortize periodically. If it's indefinite, rather than amortizing it, I will test for impairment annually. Yun. So basically, that's how you create the difference. So to summarize, the subsequent measurement for intangible assets would be measure that net IA, which is cost minus accumulated amortization minus accumulated impairment. But please take note na yung impair or yung test of impairment annually is only required for those that have indefinite useful life. While yung depreciation, sorry, it should be amortization. While yung amortization is for those that have definite or useful life. So last thing na I want to highlight is that there is, aside from the annual test of impairment for those that have indefinite useful life, there should be additional tests for impairment if there are indications of impairment. So what am I saying? Pag definite useful life ng intangible asset, you amortize annually, let's say, if it's a year. If yung period niya yearly, right? And then, if it's indefinite useful life, you will test for impairment annually. But regardless, if it's finite or indefinite useful life, pag merong indication na na-impair yung asset, you need to test for impairment and impair them accordingly. So meaning, if I have a patent that has a useful life of 20 years, what I will do is amortize that yearly. But parang sinabi sa akin ng analyst ko, oy, parang na-impair ata. Even though it's finite useful life, I will conduct an additional test for impairment. And then I will impair accordingly. Another scenario. I bought a goodwill for the company. Usually, I test for impairment annually on every December. So, itong company nito, I've tested last December, na-impair ko na. Come July, merong hints or indications of impairment. Now, you'd argue, bakit hindi na lang sila maghintay until December? Just because they're impairing it naman annually. That's incorrect. As long as meron ng hint na nag-impair yung asset, you have to test an additional test of impairment. So for that particular year, I'll do 2 tests for that indefinite useful life intangible asset. One is the yearly on December and the one in July because there were indications of impairment. So kindly take note na there will be an additional test for impairment. But generally, the simple concept remains na we measure IA at cost and then subsequently measure them at net IA, which is just basically minus ACT amortization minus ACT impairment. So now, let's classify, right, intangible assets. So this is, again, to summarize, we initially recognize them at cost. And in essence, there are 5 intangible asset types, right? So you have your patent, your copyright, your trademark, your franchise, and goodwill. But before we discuss or take a deep dive in each of these major classifications of intangible assets, there is one subtopic that I want to quickly brush upon, which would be research and development costs. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with patents, but then usually patents are usually attached to mga inventions, right? And in order for you to arrive at that invention that's patentable, or a book or an artistic work that you can copyright, sometimes that will entail research and development costs. So in essence, when someone asks you to define what are research and development costs, basically they are expenditures that may lead to patents, copyrights, new processes, and new products. Now, we can further break this down. You have your research cost and your development costs in terms of your R&D. Yung research cost are expense when incurred, meaning if it's a research cost by its own, it's expense when incurred. However, development costs may be capitalized. However, there is a strict criteria when you capitalize development costs. These are the strict criteria in order for something to be capitalized as development cost, meaning hindi mo siya i-expense. But the major thing is that it has to be commercially viable and technically feasible. So those are the 2 terms that you need to really look into if the question is, am I gonna capitalize development costs or not, right? So please, at the end, make sure to review the criteria. Pero ang keywords talaga here would be commercially viable and technically feasible. So with that said, I think it's time to take a deep dive in terms of each of the intangible assets, starting with patents. So what are patents? Basically, it's an exclusive right issued by a patent office. So here in the Philippines, it's the IPO, or the Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines. And basically, when you have a patent, what it enables you is that you have exclusive rights to manufacture, sell, or control an invention. Meaning, bawal kang gayahin kasi it's patented or protected. So, pare, you have groundbreaking invention like yung toothpaste parang na-roll up faster or something like that. If you apply for a patent and it's awarded to you, then for a certain period of time, ikaw lang yung pwedeng mag-manufacture nun, right? So that in essence is a patent. Now, what are the things that you need to include in terms of initial recognition for patents? Obviously, yung purchase price, right? So with additional taxes. Second, any cost to secure the patent like licensing fees, legal fees, registration fees, kailangan i-capitalize nyo as patent. And any other directly attributable cost that is intended to create the purchase for its intended use. Now, what are outright expense? R&D costs are outright expense with the exception of some development costs that fit the criteria. And cost to defend the patent. So please be careful about cost to defend patent. So pare, may patent ka na. And then meron kang competitor, they want to legally challenge na, hindi nila patent yan, ninakaw lang nila yung design. So they sue you. So you go into court and then you have legal fees to protect your patent. Now, some of you might be tempted na, let's capitalize that legal fees. When in fact, it should be expensed because defending your patent, regardless kung successful yung pag-defend or not, won't enhance the value it provides. it only maintains or protects it. Therefore, please take note na when you're defending patents, yung legal fees doon are outright expense. So that's basically how you account for intangible assets in initial recognition. Now, how do you subsequently recognize? Basically, you amortize patents because it has a legal life of 20 years. So now, you amortize using the shorter of the legal life or the useful life. Please memorize ano yung legal life ng patents. The legal life of patents are 20 years, but it could be extended. It's determined by the government. So sometimes, I think I remember one of the exercises or quizzes back in my time, hindi sila nagbigay ng useful life. And then I was like, how can I amortize this if hindi ko alam the period? And then I remembered, may legal life pala yung patent, but I didn't memorize it. So please make sure na you memorize it kasi it could be silent. The problem can tell you na, ito lang yung cost of the patent. What is the carrying amount after 5 years? You need to know or memorize the 20 years yung useful life so that you know what to divide it from, right? So, what do you mean by shorter of legal life and useful life? So, this is an example. If a patent has a 30-year useful life, we compare it to their legal life of 20 years. Sino yung mas maikse? Syempre, yung 20 years. And therefore, we amortize over 20 years. Versus, if a company has a patent with 15 years useful life, sino yung mas maikse? The 15-year useful life or the legal life of 20? Syempre, yung useful life. So we amortize over 15 years. So with that said, let's account for patents. So in essence, for this particular, they gave you 4 costs. And then you ask yourself, is it patent? Should it be capitalized as patent? Or should it be expense? So let's go to first, R&D costs to develop a product to which a patent was issued. Now, generally, R&D costs are expense unless parang mayroong sinabi, technical feasibility, commercial viability, etc., etc. So for here, this 1.6 million will therefore be expense. Legal fees for patent registration. Okay, this is to secure the patent, so this is capitalizable. Filing fees to City Hall to secure patent, again, to secure the patent. And then, you have paid attorneys for patent defense. So, the case was successful. Regardless whether it's a successful or not, defending your patents would just be outright expense. So, at the end of the day, your total patent, if they ask you, how much should your patent be? It should be 300,000 comprised of these 2 costs. And then others are outright expense. So your patent right now is 300,000. So when you journalize the entry, basically you have debit patent 300,000. The R&D costs are outright expense because it didn't fulfill the criteria. And then you have legal costs of 450,000. And then you total credit cash 2.35 million. So other examples. So again, patent with R&D. Sabi nila na they delve into a lot of research and development in order to arrive with the patent. So how do we account for this? So first, purchase of special equipment to be used solely for development of the new machine that they want to patent. So this is a developmental cost. The next question is, does it fit the criteria? Well, it didn't say anything about commercially viable or technically feasible. So this is expense. Next, research salaries and fringe benefits for engineer, parang research cost. So, expense. Cost of testing prototype. So this is to test the prototype, not anything to do with the patent. This is more of a development cost. Again, the criteria is not fulfilled because silent in terms of commercially viable. So it's outright expense. And then the last 3 would be filing the patent, of course, capitalized. Fees to pay to government patent office, capitalized. And then this is a new term. Drawings required by the patent office to be filled with the patent application. So the question is, okay, hindi natin alam tong term na to. The next question you ask is this cost used to secure the patent? Well, the answer is yes. Kailangan mong gawin yung drawings in order for you to get the patent. and therefore it is capitalized. So out of the 2.49 million, 240,000 is capitalized as patent, while 2.25 million is outright expense. So again, the journal entry would be 240,000 debit patent, R&D costs, which are expenses of 2.25 million, and then cash of 2.49 million. So actually, we're done with patent. So parang ganun lang. In essence, parang the next 5, parang ganun lang yung mga exercises natin. Before I proceed to the others, are there any questions? Kindly thumbs up if everything is clear. Sure. Here's the first example. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, yun. So again, ang mastery lang dito, ano ba yung mga short probs na you can expect? Number 1, patent. Number 2, I mean, parang classification kung patent pa siya or outright expense. And then ano yung mga journal entries. And then caveat, madali lang siya because we're taking it one intangible assets at a time. But given I feel like bulk of the coverage generally will be PPE. What you can expect for mineral resources and tangible assets is paghahalo yan. So, meaning, don't be confident na, hindi, sa patent lang ako mag-specialize in, then bahala na si copyright. Most of the problems in intangible assets, pinaghahalo. So, may patent, may copyright, may franchise, and then ask sa inyo, what is the carrying amount of all the intangible assets? So, please master each topic one at a time. But be prepared na they will be parang sabay-sabay rin sila itatanong. There. So we're done with patent. We're done with patent, and now we know that the thing that you need to memorize is that patents have a legal life of 20 years. That is extendable. Let's now move on to copyright. So copyright refers to artistic, creative, or published work. And then again, like the patent, it gives the owner exclusive right to reproduce and sell work. So in essence, pag may book, may intellectual property right ka in terms of the copyright, and it should be capitalized as an asset. So ano yung mga costs similar to patent? Anything that you need to secure the copyright is capitalized. R&D are outright expense. So now, in terms of amortization for copyright, it's trickier because the legal life is the life of the author plus 50 years after their death. So, or life of the artist plus 50 years after their death. So, it's not as clear-cut. So, if ever, kailangan nyo malaman kung kailangan namatay yung author or artist. I think they'll just be explicit about how much of the legal life is left. But generally, it's the shorter of the legal life plus the useful life. So let's look at an example for copyright. So in 2020, car company has copyright on the book whose owner died back in 2000. They initially thought that there were still 45 years of useful life, but now they estimate it can only generate positive cash flows for 25 years. The carrying amount of the copyright is 5,000. What is the carrying amount in 2025? So let's digest. Number 1, what is the legal life of the copyright? It said na today is 2020. Now, the artist died in 2000. So, therefore, we know that you have 50 years after the artist died. So, the copyright will expire in 2050. Right now is 2020. So, the legal life, you have 30 years to go from 2020 to 2050, right? Now, we compare the legal life between the useful life. So, the question is, ano yung useful life? Yung 45 years or yung updated estimate that it can only generate positive cash flows? In essence, ang tamang useful life here is the 25 years because nag-update. So, ang useful life, this is the definition of it, is that it's the period wherein you expect generate positive cash flows. So, therefore, from 45 years, naging 25 years yung useful life. So now, how do we amortize the copyright? We need to find out ano yung shorter of legal life and useful life. And therefore, we know that we should use the useful life. So now that we're clear about the useful life, we will amortize. And honestly, amortization, again, is just depreciation. Particularly, parang siyang straight line depreciation. Wherein, you need to know the depreciable amount or amortizable amount or whatever. Basta gets natin na there's a depreciable amount which is the cost minus the residual value. But generally, this is just for theory. Generally, intangible assets don't have residual values. So, it's usually at cost. So, pero just be aware na depreciable amount pa rin, quote unquote. And then divide mo by the shorter of useful and legal life, which is 25 years, right? So 5 million divided by 25. So if we were to compute 5 million, which is the depreciable amount or the amortizable amount, whatever, divided by 25 years, it will give you an annual amortization of 200,000. Now, ano yung shortcut natin in order to get for 2025? Similar to our shortcut in depreciation. We get the annual amortization of 200,000. We determine how many years to December 31. 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, right? So, assume natin na they bought the patent December 2020, right? So, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. So, 5 years. Now, your accumulated amortization will therefore be 1 million. So, what is the carrying amount of your copyright? It's basically the cost of your copyright at 5 million minus your amortization, not active, of 1 million. And then you will get a carrying amount of 4 million. So, in essence, every year you will record amortization expense debit of 1 million, credit accumulated amortization of 1 million. So basically, that's it for copyright. Are there any questions for copyright? If none, kindly thumbs up if everything's okay. So sana you can see na literally amortization is just straight line depreciation with a different name. Basically, it's just amortization. Okay, sure. Here's the computation, and then kindly take note that there should be amortization, right? And then please be prepared for parang mid-year purchase. So hindi na siya magiging as straight cut as times 5, right? So it was purchased July. So magiging 5.5 years. So rather than an annual amortization, you need to know the monthly amortization. So what do I mean by that? I don't have the example per se now in terms of like the illustrative example, pero kindly follow na lang. So let's say July mo binili yung patent in 2020. So you'll have what? August, September, October, November, December to the end of 2020. So you have 5 additional months. So now, we need to look at it not in terms of years, but in terms of months. So 5 times 12 is 60 and then 65. So basically may 65 months ka. So rather than using 200,000, we divided by 12 to get the monthly amortization rate of 16 whatever times 65. Ito yung amortization for the 65 months. So the reason I'm just highlighting it is that in PPE, in amortization, it's good na you're already familiar with the basics, but please be wary of mid-year purchases. Yung mid-year purchases yung nagpapahirap ng depreciation, amortization, and ng depreciation and amortization. So kindly take note lang of those possibilities, right? Yeah. So if there are no more questions, we're done with the 2. We know that the patent has a legal life of 20 plus years because it's extendable. And the copyright has a legal life of the life of the artist plus 50 years after their death. Next are trademarks. So ano ba ang trademark? So a trademark can be, a logo, something that, a company is known for. It could be a phrase, it could be a jingle, it could be a symbol, right? So yung mga slogans could be trademark. So in essence, the strict definition of a trademark is it's a distinguishing mark that identifies a particular business, product, service, or entity. So now, yung trademark mo, there are two ways. Para siyang building. You can acquire it. So you have to capitalize the purchase price, non-refundable VAT, registration, or you can develop a trademark. So some of the trademark development costs would be lawyers' fees, registration fees, design costs, and other related costs to secure it. What are outright expense? Advertising costs and research and development costs that don't fit the criteria. So ang trademark generally are tested for impairment. Why is it generally tested for impairment? Because the legal life sorry. Sorry. May nag-request na mag-copyright. Yeah. So here's the copyright for this. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So sa trademark, so I was saying, trademark generally are tested for impairment. Generally. But then, this is the type of intangible asset na kulitin nyo kami kung finite or indefinite yung useful life. Why? It's because the legal life of trademarks are 10 years but can be renewed for periods of every 10 years. So, it's generally considered indefinite kasi hindi mo alam kung magre-renew siya or not eh. So, please make sure na pag sa trademark, it's explicitly stated in the problem that it's indefinite or finite. So, pag indefinite, then we test for impairment annually. But sinabi, yung legal life niya is not 10 years but 12 years, etc., etc. Then, sometimes it's finite and therefore we amortize. So, let's just be careful. So, generally, you test for impairment lang if ang sinabi lang sa inyo is it can be renewable. And then, pag binigay yung explicit legal life, and then yung explicit useful life, then that's shorter off, and then you amortize. So, let's account for trademarks. So, the carrying amount of the trademark is 4.7 million. It's a renewable trademark for every 10 years, and at the year end, company computed its value to just be 4.5 million. Now, it's explicit in the problem that this is an indefinite useful life because it says na it's renewable trademark for every 10 years. Wala siyang binigay na legal life na strictly kung ano yung finite number. Wala siyang binigay na useful life. And therefore, you can assume na it's indefinite. And therefore, rather than amortizing, we test for impairment. How do you test for impairment? You look at the carrying amount, which is 4.7 million. Then you do a test of impairment and you will arrive with a value, which is 4.5 million. Since it's lower, we have to bring it down to 200,000. What if the scenario is, and then this is your journal entry. Impairment loss, 200,000. Credit accumulated impairment of 200,000. Right? And therefore, another caveat for this is, paano kung nung nag-test sila for impairment, nalaman nila na the trademark was 4.8 million? Will you have an impairment gain? The answer is no. Chine-check nila yung impairment because your carrying amount should not be higher than your recoverable value. So if 4.8 yan, wala tayong journal entry. Right? You leave it as is at 4.7. Only pag bumaba yung value at 4.5 or 4.4. Right? So basically, your trademark net is 4.5 million rather than 4.7 because it was impaired due to the annual test of impairment. Are there any questions for trademark? So I leave it up to you to look for trademark items na have finite lives. But in essence, it's the same method of amortization. Are there any questions? If none, I think we can proceed to franchise. So we're done now with the three. We know that trademarks can have finite or indefinite useful life, but please take note na yung legal life niya is 10 years, periodically renewable. So, kulitin nyo kami in the problem kung kung hindi stated. Pero may mga hints naman on indefinite or finite, right? For franchise, so we're in the fourth out of the five intangible assets. So, franchise, I think ang pinakamadaling isipin na franchise, Potato Corner. So basically, how it works is Potato Corner created a brand, which is actually one of our clients. So basically, client namin Potato Corner, and how it works is that you have a core company, right? The mother company. So sila yung nag-generate ng mga products, ganyan-ganyan. And then, basically, to look for investors, if you're interested to have a franchise of your own Potato Corner, we'll give you everything. We'll give you the ingredients, the super good powder, parang we'll give you in batches. We'll help you set up your stall. Pero kayo lahat magbabayad. So we'll give you the right to resell our product. But yung property itself is sa akin or some other company. I'll just give you a period of time wherein you can franchise. Right? So basically, si franchisor is si Potato Corner major company. And then si franchisee is basically like like my sister who wants to avail her like a franchise, right? So basically, the franchisor grants the franchisee what? The right to sell certain products, to provide specific services, or even use the certain trademark or trade name. So basically, si Potato Corner, yung potato, may trademark yun, bawal kopyahin, right? So me as a franchisee, I can use that logo and I can use the mascot because I have that right based on the franchise. So basically, same, you capitalize as franchise things that help you secure the franchise, and then you outright expense advertising costs. So for franchise, it's obviously, wala ka ng question, it's the finite useful life. So you amortize using the useful life. Walang legal life si franchise. It depends on a per contract basis. So we amortize periodically. So Podico bought a Potato Corner franchise for 2.04 million years ago. Hindi sinabi kung when. An independent consultant estimated the useful life to be 50 years. And the amortized cost of the franchise to date is 680,000. So the reason why I'm highlighting this is because, sorry, kindly give me, I'll just plug in my laptop. Wait lang. Okay, so bakit ko binigay yung problem na to? Because I want to test your mastery when it comes to depreciating amortization, right? Basically, binigay sa inyo yung unamortized 680,000. The things that you have to ask would be, number one, yung 50 years ba, is that the total useful life or the remaining useful life? I think that in terms of English comprehension, yung 50 years refer to the whole useful life. Now, yung unamortized cost of 680,000 means na there are a number of years that have passed already, and that's why yung carrying amount is 680,000. So basically, in order for me to arrive with the annual amortization, ano yung nasa depreciable amount ko? Is it the 680,000 or the 2.04 million? Since we're referring to the 50 years as the total life from the start, kailangan ang kukunin ko is the carrying amount at the start. Right? Hindi yung 680,000. So, therefore, it's 2.04 million divided by 50 years. So, my annual amortization is 480,000. So, we have amortization expense of 480,000, amortization of 40,800, which we will then subtract from the 680,000, which is the carrying amount at the start of the period. So, therefore, after mo mag-advertise for that particular year, it's gonna be 680,000 minus 40,800, which is 639,200. So kindly take note. So again, you can be really good at computing na. Pero please read the problems carefully. Be careful kung useful life ba in totality or remaining useful life yung binigay, right? And then understand, yung cost is different from the carrying amount because yung carrying amount na subtractan na yan ng mga accumulated impairment. Ay accumulated amortization, right? So that basically ends our franchise example. So are there any questions for franchise? If none, so questions for franchise. Okay. So last, so goodwill. So goodwill out of everything is the weirdest intangible asset. And honestly, it's very rare because it only happens during one time. So goodwill arises from the acquisition of another business. So how does it work? Kuwari, I want to buy for example, I'm an avid UP fan, right? And I super love how Nowhere to Go But Up uses their merchandise. So in essence, if I get to talk to the owner, I'll tell them, I'll tell them, oh, I super love the brand. Would it be possible for me to buy Nowhere to Go But Up, right? So yung if the owner parang they want na parang relax na lang sila, they'll agree to the sale. What they will show me would be their financial assets. And then, as you know, in terms of their balance sheet, nakalist yan in terms of like their subsequent measurement. But aside from that, their assets, aside from the carrying amount, will have a respective fair value amount. So let's say, Nowhere to Go But Up is equal to like around 800,000 total. The fair value of their net assets is 800,000. But for me, given na pare magcha-champion yung UP back to back and parang they have really good connections with the players, I'd offer them rather than paying them 800,000, na sige, I'll pay you 1 million as a sign of goodwill for the product. So the purchase price ko of 1 million is higher than the fair value of all of their net assets of 800,000. Therefore, merong 200,000. That 200,000 is what you call goodwill. It's separable from the entity kasi alam natin that the entity costs 800,000. There's an excess 200,000 na binayaran ko sa kanila. And that is an asset called goodwill. So sometimes, so this is a very simplified example, but sometimes companies pay more to acquire other businesses because of certain attributes like exceptional management, desirable location, or good customer relation. And therefore, since I bought it, you can't amortize goodwill. You just test for impairment annually. A goodwill has an indefinite useful life, right? So you never amortize goodwill. You only test for impairment annually. So let's account for goodwill. What does fair value of net assets? What does that mean in terms of a classic example? Basically, ganito yan. So, let's imagine lang na this is not, Podico paid 6 million to purchase Britot Ltd. When you ask for the financial statements, Britot will give you two things. The carrying amount of all of their assets and their liabilities, and then the fair value. Now, wala tayong pakialam sa carrying amount. What's in their books, wala tayong pakialam. What we want is the fair value of their net assets. So we need to fill up this table. What is the fair value of cash? 50,000. What is the fair value of AR? 500,000. What is the fair value of inventory? 1 million. What is the fair value of their patent? 250,000. What is the fair value of their PPE? 2 million. 3.5. Sorry. So, yeah. So, ang fair value ng PPE nila is 3.5. And then my liabilities, my fair value is 2 million. But since it's a liability, I will add all of my assets and then subtract the fair value of my liability. Kaya ang tawag, net assets. Right? Net assets is fair value of your assets minus fair value of your liability. Yes? So if you add all of these and subtract the fair value of the liability, you will arrive at your fair value of net assets at 3.8 million. Now, what is the goodwill? The goodwill is the purchase price of 6 million minus the FV of net assets of 3.8 million. So my goodwill or the excess would be 2.2 million. So with this, I know na 2.2 million yung goodwill ko. So my journal entry will look like this when I acquire that business. I get the cash, I get the AR, I get inventory, I get the patent, I get the PPE, all at fair value. I also get some of their liabilities at fair value in terms of their accounts payable. But in order for it to balance, I have a goodwill of 2.2 million, which is an intangible asset that I need to test for impairment annually. Are there any questions? So at this point, we're done with intangible assets, right? So kindly take note in terms of all of these things. So now let's have a comprehensive problem. So in terms of like the types of exercises, this is more of a representation of what you can expect. So Nelson Company, organized in 2020, has the following transactions related to intangible assets. So malulunod ka kasi ang daming dates na naman. And then, parang magpapanik ka, right? But, like what I told you, and this is something that's very applicable to your quiz, break the problem down per expertise. Let's break it down to patent. So, let's look at the patent first. They purchased a patent on May 2020 for 560,000. So, my journal entry would obviously be debit patent, credit cash of 560,000. Now, what is the depreciable amount? 560,000. Walang residual value. So we look at the cost. 560,000. How many years? 7 years. So my annual amortization is 80,000. However, when was it purchased? It was purchased May. Therefore, it's a mid-year purchase. I need to know the amortization for how many months? May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. I need to know the amortization for 8 months, right? So I need to take my annual amortization of 80,000 times 8 over 12 so that I can get my amortization expense for the year, which is 553,333. So now it's debit amortization expense, credit accumulated amortization of 53,333. Next, there was something mentioned about the goodwill. So we acquired the business and recognized goodwill worth 360,000. The value of the goodwill on year end was 200,000. So first is my goodwill, I will recognize as debit goodwill credit cash for 360,000. And then I will test for impairment on December. The carrying amount is 360. The value right now is 200,000. So I am impaired by how much? 160,000. Bumaba ng 160,000. And therefore, my journal entry on December would be impairment loss, debit, credit, accumulated impairment of 160,000. Third, franchise. So, bumili ka rin ng franchise of 440,000 nung July. So, same. Debit franchise, credit cash of 440,000. Initial recognition at cost. Next, I need to amortize. What is the depreciable amount? Cost minus residual value. Walang residual value na binigay, so 440,000. How many years? 8 years. Therefore, my annual amortization is 55,000. Now, how many months? It was a mid-year purchase. So how many months? July, August, September, October, November, December. 6 months. So now, I take the annual amortization of 55,000 multiply it by 6/12 to represent the amortization for the months of July to December to get the amortization expense of 27,500. And therefore, my journal entry would be debit amortization expense, credit app amortization of 27,500. And then last is R&D, which is basically development cost prior to technological feasibility. So it's before technological feasibility. And therefore, since it's before and not when it has technological feasibility, we outright expense the R&D cost, right? So for this comprehensive problem, if I ask you what is the net intangible assets, you just add the 506 carrying amount of patent, the 200,000 of goodwill, and the franchise of 412,000. And then as you can notice, yung patent, since it's may finite, it has an act amortization. Si goodwill is indefinite, so it has act impairment. And si franchise, since may legal life siya and useful life, is an act amortization. But generally, it works the same. May cost ka, and then binabawasan mo siya through the years, right? So that finishes our deep dive for intangible assets. Are there any questions for IA? So we're done. So we're done now with IA. So remember, nasa R&D, I was telling you that there are certain criteria, and the keywords is that the project should reach commercial viability, should reach technological feasibility. All R&D costs prior, meaning before nila ma-reach yung commercial viability and technological feasibility, should be outright expense, right? So yun lang for R&D, right? Okay. Fine. Clear. Got it. Yeah. So we're done. And then honestly, mineral resources is just basically the same. So basically, mineral resources, the same, pero ang term is depletion, right? So mineral resources consist of underground deposits of non-regenerating resources. So you're thinking about oils, you're thinking about gas, you're thinking about ores in terms of mineral resources. Now, what are the characteristics of a mineral resource? You think of pen, right? It's physically extracted in operation. So if you've seen like an oil rig, di ba parang kinukuha nila from the ground, and it's non-regenerating. Meaning, it's replaceable only by an act of nature. So, it's a natural resource. So, hindi siya parang artificially pwede mong, hindi siya parang equipment na i-upgrade mo, palitan mo yung parts. We're dependent on Mother Nature for mineral resources. So, again, what are the characteristics? Pen. Physically extracted and non-regenerating. So, how do you capitalize mineral resources? So, basically, you capitalize purchase price and any costs to prepare for intended use. And then you capitalize exploration and evaluation assets if they fit certain criteria. So drills, rigs, permits, and rights. So it could be tangible or intangible. In terms of measurement, it's the same. You initially recognize at cost, but you subsequently measure at net mineral resources because that's gonna be cost minus act depletion minus act impairment. So again, iniba lang yung pangalan ng depreciation. Depletion lang siya kapag mineral resources. And depletion is similar to your units of activity, wherein you want to get your depletion expense per unit by dividing your depreciable amount by your total estimated units. And then you multiply your units of extracted to your DPU to get your depletion expense. So again, wag malito, they're the same thing. Right? So, PPE, depreciation. Mineral resources, depletion. Intangible assets, amortization. So, different names, but similar concepts. So, your journal entry will still be the same. Debit, mineral resources, credit, cash for initial recognition. And then, debit, depletion expense, credit, act depletion for any depletion for the year. So, let's account for mineral resources. So you have Jackie Chan Mining purchased for 7 million yen a mine that is estimated to have 28 million tons of ore. In the first year, 4.7 million tons of ore are extracted. So, prepare the journal entry to record depletion for the first year. So, yung mineral resources natin is debit mineral resources, credit cash of 7 million. And then, how do we solve for the depletion? Parang units of activity lang. So, what's the depletable amount? 7 million. What's the useful life? It's measured by the 28 million tons of ore. So 7 million divided by 28 tons of ore will give you a DPU of 0.25. So how many tons were extracted raw? 4.7 million. So 0.25 divided by 4.7 million, you have an ACT depletion of 1.175. And therefore, the carrying amount of that mineral resource is 7 million minus 1.175, you will have a carrying amount for that mineral resource at 5,825,000. So yung journal entry mo doon is debit depletion expense, credit act depletion of 1.175 million. So that's it. So we're done with mineral resources. So again, it's the same, but again, hindi ba lang yung pangalan, which is depletion. So that ends our deep dive for mineral resources. And the last is we just analyze the PPE using the financial statements. So for intangible assets, again, the only difference is that it's minus ACT amortization. So in the pure gold, you will see na meron silang goodwill and other intangibles at 2.9 million. And then, you can see na it's at net. Si leasehold rights is at net. Si computer software and licenses is at net. And then, ito yung sample breakdown. How did they arrive with this number? Meron siyang balance, then minus accumulated amortization equal to your carrying amount of 123,000. Kaya siya. So, palaki siya ng malaki. So, in the balance sheet statement, it's a one-line item, goodwill and other intangibles. In the notes, may breakdown on ano yung net niya from start of the year to end of the year. And then, meron rin computation on paano siya inamortize. For mineral resources, it's the same. So this is from Nickel Asia. So they have PPE. And then in the PPE, they mentioned the mining properties. And then, it's all about the mine rehabilitation and how they estimated the ore. And then yung breakdown ng PPE, meron silang mining properties and development cost, which is our mineral resources. And then it's depleted. So these are just some of the examples. So with that said, we're finally done with the last topic for 99.2. So we're done with PPE, investment property, intangible assets, and mineral resources. So at this point, are there any questions? But if none, reminding everyone na we have last 2 sessions. I'll just have a poll if you want to have a synchronous session pa for Thursday or you'd prefer na lang na i-upload like a recorded lecture over the weekend dun sa 3 items lang ata ng mineral resources. Again, these are all bonus items. Pambawi for those na had low exercise grades or those na may late submissions. But with that said, yun. We'll just have 1 session na lang for the exercise and then 1 quiz on Monday and then finals. Yun. Thank you so much. Are there any questions before I officially end the recording? If none, kindly thumbs up in the chat if everything's okay. Okay, perfect. So, okay. And then sorry, kindly remind me kung some people pala mentioned na they also prefer parang itong mga slides na to. So I'll try to upload the PDF rin for this one. Yeah. There. Sorry. Ito yung problem for mineral resources. Yeah. And then, ito yung solution. Okay. There. So, that ends our session for PBE. So, good luck everyone. So, we'll just conduct a poll na lang on the Facebook group. Thank you.